In the winter of 208 AD, alongside the muddy banks of the Yangtze River, the largest army ancient China had ever seen prepared to enter the annals of legend. What happened next would shatter an empire, forge three kingdoms, and alter the course of Chinese civilization forever. This was not simply a battle for territory or riches. It was a clash between the dying breaths of a dynasty and the birth of an age that would echo through eternity. Imagine this scene, nearly 250,000 soldiers stretching across the horizon like a living sea of bronze and steel. War banners snapping in the winter wind, the thunder of horses, and the groans of supply wagons laden with enough provisions to feed a city formed a mighty tide. Marching at the head of this unstoppable force was the most feared warlord in all of China, Cao Cao. His eyes were fixed on a prize that had eluded conquerors for generations, total dominion over the Middle Kingdom. Yet standing in his path were forces that would prove far more dangerous than expected, not because of their numbers, for they were vastly outmatched, nor because of their weapons, but because they possessed something that would turn the waters of the Yangtze into a furnace and transform certain defeat into miraculous victory. The year 208 marked the end of an era that had lasted nearly 4 centuries. The mighty Han Dynasty, once the greatest empire on earth, was crumbling like ancient parchment. Regional warlords carved up the realm like vultures feasting on a carcass. The emperor had become little more than a puppet, a terrified child clutching a throne that commanded no respect. In this chaos, ambitious men saw opportunity, none more so than Cao Cao. By 208 AD, Cao Cao had methodically conquered the entire northern half of China through brilliant military campaigns that left his rivals crushed and scattered. His victory at the Battle of Guandu had eliminated his greatest northern competitor, and with the defeat of the Wuhuan tribes at White Wolf Mountain, his flanks were secured. Now, with the north firmly under his iron grip, only one prize remained: the lush, prosperous lands of the south, where 2 warlords still dared to defy him, Liu Bei and Sun Quan. These names would soon become legends. In 208, however, they were merely obstacles standing between Cao Cao and his destiny. Liu Bei, a distant relative of the imperial family, claimed legitimacy through royal blood. Sun Quan, still in his 20s, governed the wealthy river valleys through inherited power. Both commanded forces that seemed laughably small compared to Cao Cao's massive army, yet neither showed any inclination to surrender. The stage was set for what should have been a simple conquest. Cao Cao's overwhelming numbers would crush all resistance, unite China under his banner, and establish a new dynasty that would last for centuries. History seemed inevitable. As autumn gave way to winter, Cao Cao's colossal army began its march south. The sight was beyond imagination. According to Cao Cao's estimates, 800,000 warriors followed his banners. Even modern scholars, while questioning this figure as propaganda, acknowledge that at least 250,000 soldiers marched through the countryside toward their fateful rendezvous with destiny. This was not merely an army. It was a migration of steel and flesh cavalry units from the northern steppes, riding alongside veteran infantry who had conquered kingdoms. Siege engineers hauled massive catapults and battering rams, while supply trains stretched for miles, carrying everything from weapons to winter clothing to medical supplies. The very earth trembled beneath their passage. Yet for all its impressive size, this mighty host harbored the seeds of its own destruction. Many of the soldiers were recent conscripts pressed into service from newly conquered territories, their loyalty questionable at best. Others were forced laborers, non-combatants swelling the ranks but contributing little fighting strength. Most critically, these northern warriors had no experience with naval warfare. They were cavalry and infantry trained for dry land, not the treacherous waters of the Yangtze River system. As winter deepened and the army pushed further south, other problems emerged. The sheer size that was supposed to guarantee victory became a liability. Supplies began to run short, disease spread through crowded camps, and men who had marched hundreds of miles without rest began to show signs of exhaustion and demoralization. By the time they reached the approaches to the Yangtze, Cao Cao's seemingly invincible force was already showing cracks. But Cao Cao pressed forward, confident that sheer numbers would overwhelm any resistance. After all, what could 50,000 Southerners do against 250,000 Northerners? The answer to that question would soon be written in fire and blood across the waters of Red Cliffs. The Southern Alliance formed to resist Cao Cao's invasion, was born of desperation and mutual necessity. Liu Bei and Sun Quan had been rivals, competing for influence and territory in the fractured landscape of southern China. Under normal circumstances, they might have fought each other while Cao Cao picked off the survivors, but these were not normal circumstances. Liu Bei had already tasted defeat at Cao Cao's hands. At the Battle of Changban, his forces had been scattered, and he had barely escaped capture. Alone, he stood no chance against the impending northern tide. Sun Quan, despite controlling the prosperous river valleys of the southeast, could only field about 50,000 troops. His kingdom was flourishing, but militarily he was outnumbered by a factor of 5 to 1. The mathematics of survival forced these former rivals into an uneasy partnership. Neither could stand alone, but together they might have a chance. The alliance was sealed through a combination of diplomatic necessity and strategic brilliance. Liu Bei dispatched his master strategist, the legendary Zhu Zhiliang, to negotiate with Sun Quan's court. Meanwhile, Sun Quan's advisors debated whether to fight or surrender. The decision to fight ultimately boiled down to a single crucial advantage possessed by the Southern Alliance. While Cao Cao's massive army was trained for land battles, the Southerners were masters of river warfare. They had grown up on the waters of the Yangtze and its tributaries, intimately familiar with every current, every seasonal change, and every tactical possibility the great river offered. This knowledge would prove more valuable than all of Cao Cao's numerical superiority. The rise of Zhao Yu emerged as the key figure in the southern resistance. At just 33, he was already recognized as one of China's most brilliant military commanders. Tall and physically imposing, chroniclers described him as possessing a captivating appearance. Combining charisma with military genius, Zhao Yu saw what others missed. Where most generals looked at Cao Cao's enormous army and saw certain defeat, Zhao Yu saw opportunity. The Northern Army, Zhao Yu realized, had critical weaknesses ripe for exploitation. Their cavalry and infantry had no experience fighting on water. They were exhausted from their long march and demoralized by disease and supply shortages. Most importantly, they would have to rely on ships to cross the Yangtze River, and ships could burn. As Cao Cao's forces reached the northern banks of the Great River, the stage was set for one of the most dramatic confrontations in Chinese history. The largest army ever assembled in ancient China faced a much smaller but determined alliance across the dark waters of the Yangtze. Neither side fully understood what was about to unfold, but both knew that the fate of China hung in the balance. The winter wines were gaining strength, and somewhere in the southern camp, a veteran general named Huang Gai was forming a plan that would turn those wines into instruments of devastation. The mystery of Red Cliffs, begins not with the battle itself, but with a question that has puzzled historians for over 13 centuries. Where exactly did this world-changing confrontation take place? The name Red Cliffs suggests towering crimson bluffs overlooking the Yangtze. Yet, no one can say with certainty which red cliffs bore witness to the flames that would reshape an empire. Scholars have debated this puzzle for over a millennium, proposing various locations from Zhejiang in Hubei province to sites near modern Wuhan. The Yangtze River itself has shifted course countless times since 208 AD, swallowing potential archaeological evidence beneath its muddy depths. Ancient place names have changed, landmarks have vanished, and the very geography that witnessed this epic confrontation has been transformed by time and nature's relentless march. What we do know is this: somewhere along the middle reaches of the mighty Yangtze, in the heart of what is now Hubei province, two armies prepared for a battle that neither truly understood. The setting was perfect for naval warfare: broad stretches of water flanked by towering bluffs, narrow channels that could funnel attacking forces into killing zones, and seasonal wines that could carry both ships and flames with devastating speed. As winter deepened in 208, Cao Cao's massive army reached the northern banks of the Yangtze and beheld the challenge before them. The great river stretched wide and dark, its waters swollen by recent rains. On the far shore, the banners of the Southern Alliance fluttered in the cold wind. Between them lay not just a river, but a watery grave that would soon claim thousands. The fatal flaw. Cao Cao's first decision would prove catastrophic, though he could not have known it at the time. Recognizing that his northern soldiers were unused to fighting on water, he ordered his warships to be chained together. This, he reasoned, would create stable platforms that would prevent seasickness and allow his men to fight as if they were on solid ground. The massive vessels were lashed side by side with heavy iron chains, forming floating fortresses that seemed impregnable. To Cao Cao and his generals, this innovation appeared brilliant. The chained ships would not rock with the waves, allowing soldiers to move easily from vessel to vessel. Cavalry horses could even be transported on these sturdy platforms. They believed they had created an unbeatable naval force that combined the strength of land and sea warfare. But across the river, Xiao Yu and his allied commanders observed the situation differently. Where Cao Cao saw stability and strength, they perceived vulnerability. The chained ships could not maneuver independently. If one caught fire, the flames would inevitably spread to the others. What Cao Cao considered his greatest tactical advantage was about to become his greatest weakness. The element of fire, a southern strategy, began to take shape around a single audacious idea: fire. The element that had been humanity's servant since the dawn of civilization would become the weapon of mass destruction. But executing a fire attack against a weary enemy required more than just burning ships. It demanded deception, courage, and a willingness to gamble everything on a single desperate plan. Enter Huang Gai, a veteran general whose name would echo through the centuries. Born into poverty and orphaned at a young age, Huang Gai had clawed his way up through the ranks with sheer determination and military skill. He had served 3 generations of the Sun family, earning a reputation for loyalty and tactical brilliance. Now, in the darkest hour of the Southern Alliance, he would propose a plan so perilous that it bordered on madness. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its execution. Huang Gai would pretend to defect to Cao Cao's side, approaching the northern fleet under the guise of surrender. His ships would be loaded not with soldiers and supplies, but with kindling, dry reeds, and oil. When the moment was right, he would set these vessels ablaze and send them crashing into Cao Cao's chained fleet like floating infernos. Everything had to align perfectly. The wind needed to blow in the right direction to carry the fire ships toward the enemy. Cao Cao had to believe that Huang Gai's defection was genuine. The timing had to be precise, allowing just enough time for the fire ships to reach their target before the flames consumed the vessels entirely. A single mistake would mean not just the failure of the plan, but the certain death of Huang Gai and his volunteers. Xiao Yu recognized both the brilliance of the strategy and its inherent risks. If the deception was discovered, Huang Gai would be captured and executed, and the Southern Alliance would lose one of its most experienced commanders. If the winds shifted at the wrong moment, the fire ships might drift harmlessly away from their targets. If Cao Cao's scouts detected the true nature of the approaching vessels too early, the entire northern fleet could scatter before the trap was sprung. Yet they had no choice. The southern forces were outnumbered by at least 4-1. In a conventional battle, they would be crushed beneath the weight of Cao Cao's army. Only through cunning and desperate courage could they hope to level the playing field. The fire attack represented their one chance to turn Cao Cao's greatest strength, his enormous chained fleet, into his greatest weakness. As the winter winds began to shift, blowing steadily from the southeast toward Cao Cao's position, Xiao Yu gave his approval. Huang Gai began preparations, selecting the vessels that would carry fire into the heart of the enemy fleet. These were not ordinary ships, but specially prepared instruments of destruction. The holds were packed with bundles of kindling and dried grass. Oil was poured over everything that could burn. Hidden beneath innocuous-looking cargo were the materials that would transform the Yangtze into a raging sea of flames. The letter Huang Gai composed to Cao Cao was a masterpiece of deception. Written in the tone of a defeated general seeking to save his own life, it offered to deliver valuable intelligence about the Southern Alliance's weaknesses and defensive positions. The message played perfectly into Cao Cao's expectations. Of course, the southern commanders would begin defecting as they realized the hopelessness of their position. Of course, a veteran like Huang Gai would choose pragmatic survival over hopeless loyalty. What Cao Cao could not see was the trap being prepared across the dark waters of the Yangtze.